This is a homily for the second Sunday of Lent. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 17, verses 1 to 9. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. Last Sunday we accompanied Jesus as he was led by the Spirit into the desert, and there he was tested. Today our Lenten journey continues, and we accompany Jesus together with Peter, James and John as they ascend a high mountain. In the presence of his disciples, Jesus is transfigured. To understand the significance of this moment, let's see where we now are in Matthew's Gospel. Matthew has retained the narrative structure of Mark's Gospel, and last Sunday we heard Matthew's account of the testing in the desert, which came from the prelude to the public ministry. Matthew has placed his account of the Transfiguration towards the end of the Galilean ministry. To appreciate fully Matthew's account of the Transfiguration, we need to have a closer look at the episode that he places immediately before the Transfiguration. Jesus and his disciples have left Galilee and are now in the region of Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi is located in Philip's tetrarchy of Iturea and Trachonitis, and it lay at the foot of Mount Hermon. At the time of Jesus, it was a thoroughly Hellenistic city, filled with shrines to the god Pan, and a temple dedicated to the Emperor Augustus. The name Caesarea honoured the Roman emperor, while Philippi referred to Philip the Tetrarch, the son of Herod the Great. It was Philip who rebuilt and enlarged the city and made it his capital. It is in the region of Caesarea Philippi that Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" Matthew's wording about the location is very careful, and it is almost certainly deliberate. He does not say that Jesus went into Caesarea Philippi, but that he came into the region of the city. Matthew allows the city to function as a symbolic backdrop rather than as a literal setting. The disciples reply to Jesus' question by saying, some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But then the question becomes more pointed, and Jesus asks, "But you, who do you say I am?" In reply, Simon Peter says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replies, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven." Jesus then goes on to say, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the underworld will never overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." From then onwards, Matthew tells us, Jesus begins to show the disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer grievously at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and to be put to death, and to be raised up on the third day. Peter protests, "God forbid it, Lord, this must not happen to you." Jesus then tells Peter that he is thinking not as God thinks, but as humans do. And Jesus presses the point further, telling his disciples that anyone who wants to be a follower of his must renounce self, take up the cross, and follow him. 6 days later, Jesus takes with him Peter, James and John and leads them up a high mountain on their own. Which mountain, we might ask? Well, the Gospels themselves show remarkably little interest in identifying the precise place of the Transfiguration. Matthew, Mark and Luke all speak simply of a high mountain without naming it. In the biblical tradition, mountains function symbolically as places of revelation. The point of the story then is to reveal who Jesus is, not where he was. So I think the evangelist would tell us that we're asking the wrong question, because the mountain is a theological rather than a geographical location. And yet, the Christian imagination loves to fill in the gaps, and believers, quite understandably, want to go on pilgrimage to the places where the biblical story unfolded. This impulse gave rise quite early to attempts to identify the mountain of the Transfiguration. Two candidates emerged, Mount Hermon and Mount Tabor. Firstly, Mount Hermon lies to the north of Caesarea Philippi. Given that Jesus and the disciples have just been in the region of Caesarea Philippi, this might seem to be the logical choice. Caesarea Philippi lies at the southern base of Mount Hermon, which is by far the highest mountain in the region, rising to over 2,800 metres. It easily satisfies the description of a high mountain, far more convincingly than any other contender. However, there is no archaeological or literary evidence of a church ever being built on the summit of Mount Hermon to commemorate the Transfiguration. It is likely that Mount Hermon never became a serious pilgrimage site because it was extremely rugged, often snow-covered at the summit, and remote from the established pilgrimage routes of the Holy Land. This brings us to the second candidate, Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor rises to about 575 metres on the eastern edge of the Jezreel Valley, standing as a distinctive dome-shaped hill rather than part of a mountain range. Though modest in height, it is visually striking, steep-sided, and unmistakably a mountain in the landscape of Galilee. From a narrative point of view, Mount Tabor is not an obvious choice. Reaching Tabor after visiting the region of Caesarea Philippi would require a significant journey south that the Gospels do not mention. For this reason, most modern scholars regard Tabor as historically unlikely as the actual site of the event, but not impossible. And yet, Mount Tabor became very early on the mountain of the Transfiguration in Christian tradition. By the late 3rd and 4th centuries, church fathers such as Origen, Cyril of Jerusalem, Jerome, and others refer to the Transfiguration as having taken place on Tabor. They do so without argument or explanation, indicating that by their time the identification was already well established. None of them attempts to justify the choice from the Gospel text. They simply pass on what had become received tradition. The decisive reason was pilgrimage. Mount Tabor lies close to Nazareth and the Galilean towns associated with Jesus' ministry, and it could easily be incorporated into emerging pilgrimage routes. Unlike Hermon, it was accessible year-round, not snowbound, and close to settled Christian communities. Pilgrims could climb it, pray there, and celebrate the liturgy without extraordinary difficulty. Sacred geography in practice follows places that can be reached, revisited and sustained as centres of worship. By the late 4th century, churches already stood on the summit of Mount Tabor. The 4th century pilgrim Egeria describes shrines there, and over the centuries they were destroyed, rebuilt and replaced. Byzantine basilicas, a Crusader monastery, and finally the modern Basilica of the Transfiguration, built in the early 20th century. Each rebuilding renewed and intensified the association until the memory of the Transfiguration became inseparable from the mountain itself. The present Basilica of the Transfiguration was built between 1919 and 1924. It was designed by the Italian architect Antonio Baluzzi. Having now discussed the possible location of the Transfiguration, I realise that I have spent a good deal of time on a detail that the evangelists would consider irrelevant. So let's now return to the Mount of Transfiguration, wherever it might have been. Matthew is telling the Gospel story against the backdrop of the Exodus story, and that is an interpretive key to help us understand the meaning of the Transfiguration. By way of background, consider this reflection by New Testament scholar Richard Hayes. Jesus and his first followers were Jews, whose symbolic world was shaped by Israel's scripture. Their categories for interpreting the world and their hopes for God's saving action were fundamentally conditioned by the biblical stories of God's dealings with the people of Israel. Therefore, it is not surprising that as the earliest Christian communities began to tell and retell stories about Jesus, they interpreted his life, death, and resurrection in relation to those biblical stories. That is, the text that Christians later came to call the Old Testament. The authors of the 4 canonical Gospels were the heirs of this tradition of storytelling, and they shared the early Christian community's passionate concern, a concern that, as far as we can tell, goes back to Jesus himself, to show that Jesus' teachings and actions, as well as his violent death and ultimate vindication, constituted the continuation and climax of the ancient biblical story. Last Sunday we saw Jesus in the desert, undergoing testing, just as Israel was tested in the wilderness after leaving Egypt. Jesus relives Israel's story, but he does so faithfully. Where Israel grumbled, Jesus trusts. Where Israel failed, Jesus remains obedient. Now, in the Transfiguration, the Exodus pattern continues. Let's now consider the parallels between Moses on Mount Sinai and Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. Matthew gives us a small but striking detail as he introduces the Transfiguration. He tells us that it took place 6 days later. That is not a throwaway line. Matthew rarely supplies precise time markers unless they matter. And here the wording is doing quiet but deliberate theological work. For a Jewish reader immersed in Scripture, 6 days immediately evokes the Exodus story. In the book of Exodus, Moses ascends Mount Sinai, and we are told that the glory of the Lord settles on the mountain for 6 days. Only on the 7th day does God call Moses into the cloud. Those 6 days are days of waiting, preparation, and awe as Israel stands below the mountain, aware that something decisive is unfolding in God's presence. By using the same time frame, Matthew invites us to hear the story of the Transfiguration against that Sinai backdrop. Jesus, like Moses, ascends the mountain. A cloud overshadows the scene. God's glory is revealed, and a voice speaks from the cloud. These are not casual similarities, they are deliberate echoes. Matthew wants us to understand that what happened on Sinai is now being replayed, but also surpassed. On Sinai, Moses enters the cloud alone and returns with the law, his face shining with reflected glory. On the mountain of Transfiguration, Jesus does not merely reflect God's glory, he is transfigured from within. His face shines and his clothing becomes dazzlingly white. The glory that once rested upon Moses now radiates from Jesus himself. A voice from the cloud says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." At Sinai, Israel was told to listen to Moses. Here Moses fades into the background, and Jesus stands at the centre. The law and the prophets are present, but they yield to the Son. This is Matthew's way of saying that the Exodus story has reached its fulfillment. The God who once revealed himself on Sinai now reveals himself definitively in Jesus. The journey that began with liberation from Egypt and covenant on a mountain now finds its meaning in the person of Christ. So when Matthew tells us that this happened 6 days later, he is not giving us a diary entry. He is giving us a theological signal. He is telling us that we are once again standing at Sinai. But this time, the revelation is not written on stone. It is standing before us, speaking, shining, and we are called to listen. Matthew's use of the Exodus as a backdrop becomes even clearer when we notice that neither Moses nor Jesus ascends the mountain alone. In the book of Exodus, Moses is summoned up Mount Sinai, but he does not go by himself. We are told that Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu accompany him part of the way up the mountain, while the elders remain below. Matthew mirrors that structure exactly. Jesus does not take all the disciples with him. He chooses Peter, James, and John, and leads them up the mountain on their own. Once again, there is a wider group left behind and a smaller group brought nearer. The Gospel does not explain why these three are chosen, just as Exodus does not explain why Moses' companions are chosen. In both stories, the central figure becomes radiant, Moses on Mount Sinai and Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. In both cases, those who witness the scene become afraid. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai, the skin of his face was radiant, and when Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, they were afraid to go near him. In the presence of Peter, James, and John, Jesus was transfigured. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as dazzling as light. A bright cloud then covers them, and a voice comes from the cloud saying, "This is my Son, the beloved. He enjoys my favour. Listen to him." The disciples are overcome with fear and fall on their faces. On the mountain of Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah suddenly appear talking with Jesus. Peter then says, "Lord, it is wonderful for us to be here. If you want me to, I will make 3 shelters here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." The word shelter translates the Greek word skene, which also means tent. It is the same word that the Septuagint uses for the temporary shelters the people are commanded to make for the feast of Sukkot. The Hebrew word Sukkot can be translated in a number of ways: booths, tabernacles, shelters, huts, or tents. Sukkot was originally an agricultural feast celebrating the completion of the harvest and praying for the autumn rains so critical for successful sowing in the coming year. The feast takes its name from the temporary shelters, Sukkot, used during harvest time when farmers took advantage of the warm summer nights to sleep out in the fields. In the course of time, this harvest festival became explicitly associated with the Exodus from Egypt. In Leviticus chapter 23, verse 43, the Lord commands the Israelites to live in Sukkot in order to remember that he made their ancestors dwell in temporary shelters after bringing them out of the land of Egypt. So when Matthew tells us that Peter wants to build 3 shelters, he is making a further allusion to the Exodus story. Peter's instinct is to dwell, to settle, and to remain, but the Exodus is never about staying on the mountain. It is about moving on, following God forward into the journey that lies ahead. Let us now turn to the presence of Moses and Elijah. Moses and Elijah, who are both speaking with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, are the only Old Testament figures who speak with God on Mount Sinai. So let us now turn to their encounters with God on Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb, as it is otherwise known. In chapter 19 of the book of Exodus, we read of Moses' encounter with God. Mount Sinai was entirely wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in the form of fire. The smoke rose like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain shook violently. Louder and louder grew the trumpeting. Moses spoke, and God answered him in the thunder. Note, God answered him in the thunder. But that was not Elijah's experience. Elijah's encounter with God on the same mountain is recorded in the first book of Kings, chapter 19. Following the showdown with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, Elijah flees the wrath of Queen Jezebel. After 40 days and nights, he reaches the holy mountain and spends the night in a cave there. He is told to go and stand on the mountain, for the Lord was passing by. Then there was a mighty wind which split the mountains and shattered the rocks. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind came an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire? Well, the Hebrew text uses 3 words. Reading from right to left, kol demama dak. Kol can be translated as voice, demama as whisper or hush, and dak as small or finely ground. It's interesting to see how different translations of the Bible have rendered these 3 Hebrew words. The Revised Standard Version has a still, small voice. The New Revised Standard Version has a sound of sheer silence. The New American Bible, a tiny whispering sound. The New International Version, a gentle whisper. The Common English Bible, a sound, thin, quiet. The Jerusalem Bible, a light murmuring sound. The Revised New Jerusalem Bible, a light sound of silence. The Good News Bible, the soft whisper of a voice. The Jewish Study Bible, a soft murmuring sound. Robert Alter's translation, a sound of minute stillness. Kol demama dak. When Elijah heard this, the barely audible voice of God, a gentle whisper, he goes out and stands at the entrance of the cave, covering his face with his cloak, a gesture that suggests that he is indeed encountering the divine presence in that stillness. The Hebrew word demama is used in Psalm 107 verse 29, where it refers to the calm that comes at the end of a storm. God spoke to Moses in the thunder. God speaks to Elijah in a more subtle language, a small, barely audible sound, a gentle whisper. This reminds us that God is not locked into any one mode of appearing. Sometimes God reveals himself in awesome theophanies, but more often than not, God is revealed through the quiet working out of daily routines. Occasionally you read stories about people who have decided to put aside their electronic devices for an hour, a day, or even a week, and have been astonished to discover the richness of life without incessant interruptions and noise. We've got to the point where a soundless world has practically ceased to exist, and we are the poorer for it. We need to recover the ability to sit in silence and await the gentle whisper. The gift of interior recollection is essential to Christian discipleship. Let us return to the scene of the Transfiguration. Matthew is making an important point by placing this episode immediately after the first prediction of the Passion. The Father's voice coming from the cloud comes only after Jesus speaks of suffering. Jesus has already accepted the necessity of the cross. He has already named the path that lies ahead, despite Peter's attempt to divert him from it. Only then does the voice from the cloud declare, "This is my Son, the Beloved. He enjoys my favour. Listen to him." The Transfiguration is a divine affirmation that the way Jesus has chosen, the way of self-giving and loss, is indeed the way that leads to life. Today's Gospel therefore marks a decisive turning point in Matthew's story of Jesus. Just before the Transfiguration, Jesus tells his disciples plainly and for the first time that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer rejection and be put to death. That comes as a great shock to the disciples. Peter has only just confessed that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. In his imagination, Messiahship and suffering simply do not belong together. So when Jesus speaks of the cross, Peter recoils. "God forbid it, Lord." This is not the future he had imagined. It is precisely at this moment of misunderstanding and resistance that Matthew places the Transfiguration. Once Jesus and the disciples come down from the mountain, the mood begins to change. Opposition increases. Jesus speaks more often and more plainly about suffering and death. And when they finally reach Jerusalem, there will be no dazzling light, no heavenly voice, no signs of glory, only arrest, rejection, silence, and a cross. So that is why Matthew places this scene where he does. He places it at this point in his Gospel so that the reader knows, as the story darkens, that nothing which happens in Jerusalem has the power to cancel what God has already declared about Jesus. The cross does not overturn Jesus' identity as God's Son. Matthew gives the reader the Transfiguration so that the Passion is not misread. The suffering and death of Jesus are not a contradiction of who he is, but the way in which his identity will truly and finally be disclosed.